We are human, we are animals, we crave the ability to be we. I know it's called me undies. We undies might have sounded differently, right?
Is it a disco now?
Yeah, it's the after party, so it's now we go with the flash.
My goal in life is to be a laptop sticker.
Me too.
And despite the best ministrations of your wife, you still look ugly.
It's a great honor, Mr. Jaffe. It's always nice to be with you.
I'm so happy to be with you. I'm honored.
Thanks for doing this, too. It's a real service to the community.
What a great organization and a show that offers hope, optimism, creative solutions, entertainment.
Thank you for doing this, Joseph. It's your gift to the universe, and it's appreciated.
Very human, and I like that.
Look at you! You are insane!
How did I do that?
You're insane!
Well, it's April 12th. It is Monday. I hope you are well. And welcome to another episode and another week of unbelievable guests. Incredible conversations that ultimately move, I hope, the world forward and offer hope, positivity, and optimism, and make my mother proud, who is watching all the way from South Africa. So, hi, Mom. Hope you are well. You may recall maybe one of my favorite guests, Daniel Gutierrez, and he said the real questions about how to be a better human being is to answer the question, when's the last time you danced? When's the last time you danced, for my South African friends? When's the last time you flew a kite? Carol and Steve flew a kite this weekend, and they sent this photo in to demonstrate it. I think it got stuck in a tree at one point, but hopefully it brought them the same joy that Daniel Gutierrez spoke about so beautifully. Today is National Colorado Day. And this is a day that Anna Bowman, one of our regulars, feels very strongly about. She certainly loves Colorado. So we decided to celebrate with her. Happy National Colorado Day to anyone who lives in Colorado or loves the state of Colorado. It is fat blogging time. I lost another 2.5 pounds this week. So if you look and you do the math, it looks like I've lost about 32 pounds since the beginning of 2020, and I will keep this up every Monday, no matter what. You can run, but you can't hide. Sorry, I can run, but I can't hide. And I continue to pursue my goal of 0. Just kidding. Something that I hope certainly doesn't hit 0 is my creator coin, my cryptocurrency. The Jaffe coin is $2.13. Give you a little bit of an update on a Monday as well. And one of the things that we're going to continue to try and figure out is how we build an economy, how we build a creator economy, how we build something together that has substance, where we can share in those rewards together. So one of the things you can look towards is the fact that people that actually own this currency, regulars to the show and previous guests, will be able to continue to access and come on and become part of this show together, rather than me be a talking head. This is about us. This is about we, not about me. Well, speaking of which, if you go to my YouTube channel, you will see the highlights of last week, the week that was, my previous guests. But we're going to now focus on my guests this week. We've got Michael Casson, Paul Epstein, and Bryce Hoffman Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, late night Jaffe on Wednesday, on Hump Day. But today we are going to celebrate, elevate Dr. Robin DiAngelo, author of White, Fragility, and Nice Racism. We're going to find out about the progression from non-racist to anti-racist to nice racist and find out what that is. Let's do birthdays very quickly. We've got Mike Pellegrino, my School of Rock teacher. We've got Tom Zawacki on Sunday on Facebook. There's Jordan Kretschmer, Clive DeFreitas, and Johnny Savan today, as well as Peter Black. On LinkedIn, Nandini Dasgupta, Tony Winders, Harriet James, JP de Klerk, Devin Davis, and Anwar Kabir. Hope you guys, no matter where you were, whether you were in lockdown, whether you were isolating, whether you were in quarantine or not, hopefully you were safe and hopefully you were fulfilled, and you were able to share in this moment and have other people sharing it with you. And if you weren't, this is why I do the birthdays. Well, now it's time to get into our seated soliloquy. And the seated soliloquy today is called Character. And I have some music for you too. I've seen firsthand that being president doesn't change who you are, it reveals who you are. Those wise words were from former First Lady Michelle Obama, and they have stuck with me ever since. I believe them to be true, but I wonder if it applies to the rest of us mortals and the rest of life. Before I get there, let me unpack this philosophical gem. The underlying premise is that you are who you are, and an opportunity on a large stage, arguably the largest, is just an amplification platform as opposed to a transformative one. What's the lesson in life? Simple. When we're given a chance to perform, we either over or underperform. We either shine or we don't. We either step up or we fall back. Our character is our very being, the fiber and the fabric that is inextricably interwoven into our identity and our psychological DNA. It is the product of our upbringing, our parents, our ancestors, our community, the sum total of our life's experiences. It is everything, and it is the only thing. You never know how you're going to act or react in a life-changing situation. The fight, flight, or freeze mentality is often our primary decision state. But what happens next is perhaps even more important. The ability to introspect and recognize these are the things that don't happen to you, they happen for you. To have faith that our character is like our very spine, our backbone, our core, but we are flawed works in progress, and there is always room for improvement, development, and change. The events of the past 12 months have changed me. Am I today who I was meant to be? Have they indeed revealed the true me? Have all the layers, barriers, or walls I built up around me, known or unbeknownst, simply melted away? Was my persona, or should I say my perceived persona, my true self, or just a contextual societal distortion? Or did I make the most of the curveball after curveball hurled at me to break through said walls and bust out of a self-imposed prison? Either way, I say this. Our character is rock solid, even immovable, but there is always room for development. As the saying goes, to err is human, to forgive divine, but maybe it's time to change that. To err is human, to forgive divine, to grow is eternal. Just some thoughts as I now have the pleasure and the privilege of bringing on today's guest, Dr. Robin DiAngelo. Dr. Robin DiAngelo is an affiliate associate professor of education at the University of Washington in Seattle. In addition, she holds 2 honorary doctorates. She has numerous publications and books. In 2011, she coined the term white fragility in an academic article which has influenced the international dialogue on race. Her book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, debuted on the New York Times bestseller list and has been translated into 10 languages. In addition to her academic work, Dr. DiAngelo has been a consultant and educator for over 20 years on issues of racial and social justice. In 2019, she visited South Africa to present her work on white fragility. I obviously have to ask her about that. Please join me in welcoming her to the show. Dr. DiAngelo, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
And is it okay if I call you Robin?
Please do.
Well, fantastic. I am just thrilled to have you on the show today. I obviously watched you many, many times on television, read you in the press. You certainly were a leading figure, voice during a very, very challenging time in this country and maybe arguably the world. But I have to say, just before we actually get into it, we always do a little bit of fun. We go from sometimes the sublime to the ridiculous on the show. And one of the reasons is I think our world right now is a bit of a manic depressive existence. The highs are super high and the lows can be super low as well. So this is a little segment that I like to call Fun Facts, where we find out some interesting things about you. You don't need to be too nervous because these fun facts were handed to me by your handlers. Just kidding. So the first thing we found out about you, and this is this is actually your graduation photo, believe it or not. You are a graduate of Sears Charm School. Yes, the department store. So tell us a little bit. I assume this doesn't even, I don't even think Sears exists anymore.
Well, and my dear friend, Edwin Cleophas, he's the head of the Social Justice Agency of South Africa, is listening right now, and he doesn't even know this. I just think it's so delightfully working class. My father was a construction worker. He was a biker. He rode a Harley, and he was determined that his 3 daughters were going to be ladies. And so he sent us to charm school, but not, some sophisticated charm school out of New York City, but Sears. And we had to, walk with books on our head, and we had to do a mannequin modeling where you put on the clothes and then you freeze in the store. And of course, I was about 14. I was incredibly shy, and I was just beginning to blossom into my hippie era. So I was really not happy about any of this.
I mean, the world has changed so much. It's just unbelievable. And then here's another story, and you can go into this as lengthy or as brief as you like. This is a crazy one. You met your husband when you taught he and his wife's childbirth class.
Doesn't that sound scandalous? It's not as scandalous as it sounds. I was a childbirth educator actually for many years. I didn't have a college degree, and I couldn't really go any further. So that's what actually led me to college, and then that led me into what I do now, which is anti-racist education. But I taught those classes, and there was a young couple that I connected with, and 10 years later, the male half of the couple, Jason, reached out. I had made an impression. He was now divorced, and we met for coffee, and here we are. So it sounds a little more scandalous than it is. Trust me, we didn't leave his pregnant wife and run off.
Well, I mean, if that were the story, you'd be able to have at least another career track, another parallel track.
Right. I don't have enough controversy in my life. Yep.
Both fiction and nonfiction. But that's just a little bit of kind of getting to know you. So thank you for being a good sport and sharing some of those. And Edwin is going, I had no idea. I had no idea. But obviously, there are, we are living through just unprecedented times. I don't think that can be said enough times. And I don't think it can be emphasized enough. As we speak, another black man has been shot and killed, not just by police, but in Minneapolis as well, Dante Wright. And we're going through just incredible times of turbulence. We're going to get into that, and we're going to talk about the Derek Chauvin trial as well. But I wanted to go back in time because I think it's apropos to actually recognize that you coined the term white fragility in 2011. The book came out in 2018. You talk about systemic racism and you talk about white supremacy. It's hard to believe even that the phrase white supremacy is part of our vernacular. Mm-hmm. It's almost as obscene as a global pandemic and almost fantastical or non-believable. But I would love for you to go back to 2011 to coining of the term, because it was preemptive and it was prophetic, but it was also, I think, probably reflective of the times we were living in then and leading up to that moment.
Yeah, and I probably was using it myself earlier than 2011, but somewhere around that time, it just came out of my mouth in a moment of frustration because I was leading anti-racist education in a variety of forms, sometimes within academia, sometimes out in communities as a consultant. And there are just some very consistent patterns. And one of them is this, actually, I don't even know if it's one of them. I think it's all of it coming together to cause white people to be so irrational. I mean, there are many ironies, if you will. Maybe a stronger way to say that is that there are many perversions in racism. And what I mean by that is that we project onto white people, the white collective projects onto Black people our own sins, right? So one of the things we say is that they're irrational about racism, they're too emotional, they're too angry, they play the race card, have a chip on their shoulder, see race everywhere. I'm sure you've all heard these sayings. And I would argue white people are the most irrational, the most emotional, play the it's never racism card. And we're the most invested in racism, in the status quo of it. And I think the least trustworthy, and there's the irony, we set ourselves up as the objective arbiters of whether or not people of color's experiences are legitimate or not, whether they're valid or not, as if we could ever be objective on something that serves and benefits us and we're so deeply invested in, consciously or not. So this consistent pattern of just falling apart in the face of this tiniest challenge. Honestly, just saying white people, there's probably people listening right now that as soon as I began to talk about white people in any general way, got upset. Right? You don't know me. You can't say anything about me if you don't know me. And that's one of the key threads, is this really precious ideology of individualism. We're taught to see ourselves as special and unique. And every one of us is outside the forces of the society we live in, apparently. And yes, we are all special and unique. And we are also members of social groups that profoundly shape the trajectory of our lives. We didn't say our pronouns. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a cisgender woman. I'm assuming you are a cisgender man. Your pronouns are he, him. I don't think most people would argue that the fact that at birth we were assigned the categories we were assigned, male for you, female for me, absolutely shaped how we were raised in every aspect, from what colors we got to what kinds of foods we were associated with, to what kind of toys we were given, right? So yes, we're individuals, you and I, but we're also members of these social groups that collectively socialize us. And we have to be willing to grapple with the collective experience, to set aside that sense that we could ever be exempt from those forces and take a look at them.
Now, those patterns, the concept of a pattern is a very interesting term and concept, because consistent behaviors, consistent reactions, consistent themes, we'll kind of flip between the two books, but in the new book you talk about some of these patterns, and there were so many of them, and I didn't even know. I struggled to pick out one, and I thought, you know what, maybe we'll talk about all of them. But one of them was this idea of carefulness, and I could only imagine that it's biting your tongue or watching what you say or being overly self-aware or self-conscious, perhaps to the detriment, maybe. Can you define what you mean by carefulness?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm talking specifically about what I would term white progressives, folks like you and I that care deeply for social justice, that see ourselves as committed to social justice, that would never want to hurt anyone across race, who are absolutely not white nationalists and don't relate to white nationalists. And yet we all play a part. right? So a lot of my work is to have each person not exempt themselves, right? My manifestation of this socialization is different than if I was a white nationalist, but I still do have some form of it, right? None of us are outside of it. And there are just very consistent patterns. One of them is carefulness. And it's carefulness that basically has us inauthentic. Right. So we are so careful not to say the wrong thing or make a mistake that we end up being reserved. Now, let me give you a little story that really brought that home for me. I was talking to a friend of mine who is Black, and I was saying, I know I have all this racist ideology in my head. I have these racist stereotypes and ideas. And I thought the goal was to be really careful not to let those out, right? I was telling her that sometimes I worried that I would relax too much and then out would slip some of this awful stuff that I've internalized. And she just looked at me for a really long time and then finally said, Robin, do you think we can't tell when you're being careful? What do you think white people look like when they're being careful with Black people, right? And it was one of those moments where you could kind of step out of yourself and look and say, oh my goodness, we look stiff, we look inauthentic, right? And contrast that to when we're with all of our white friends, not worrying about that, and we're relaxed and we're open. And the key is thoughtful. I mean, we need to be thoughtful. Absolutely do not hear me saying, oh yeah, just blurt out anything you want. But there is a difference between being thoughtful and aware, holding awareness on some level of your position as a white person in relationship to others, but not so careful that we're not real. If we do step in it, well, I hate that that's at the expense of other people, but my deepest learning have come from my mistakes. I'm just simply not going to learn and grow when everything is comfortable. So we take those moments. We don't use them to give up and say, forget it then. I can't do anything right. I'm not going to say anything. We don't go there. That's classic white fragility. We say, okay, what can I learn from this and how can I do different?
I think, as you were talking, and even before you said the word inauthentic versus authentic, that was the word that I was almost mouthing, which is, we can only be ourselves and hopefully have the confidence and the and the assuredness to be able to at least when we, as you say, step in it, as we often do. Most of us, we take our left foot out our mouths in order to insert the right one, or at least I do. But it's the ability to own it and accept it, and then to take steps to change it and make sure it doesn't happen again. That doesn't seem to me to be very too difficult for human beings. And yet, as I was saying, ...
There are a lot of things that I don't think are rocket science and appear to be. And it appears that many white people do not understand the concept of socialization. And we really think that we can be outside of that we just see the world in unique and special ways, rather than, the way that we were taught to make meaning of the world in our particular cultures. So there are a couple of ideas that I want to pull from your opening and right there. And this idea that there's a true self or our self or, right, that's not really who I am. And I'm going to challenge that. Keep in mind, I'm a sociologist, so I don't think there's some true self that's unified and intact and stationary and never changing. Who I am changes in relationship to who I'm interacting with. It changes in relation to the cultural context. The example I often give is, well, you'd be surprised because I'm going to actually give this example, which is odds are I'm not going to just begin without thought talking to you about menstruation and any struggles I might have with it. But I could walk into a bathroom, see another woman, never saw her in my life, and just begin talking about menstruation. right? And I'm not even consciously going, oh, this is a woman now. It's just we're constantly shifting in and out, reading our environment, and automatically adjusting. One of the stories I open my book Nice Racism with is going to dinner with another couple, a Black couple that I hadn't met before. And in my urgency to prove I wasn't racist, immediately, right? As soon as I see this couple is Black, I need to prove to them I'm not racist. Now, this happened back in the 90s, so I wouldn't be doing this today. And so how did I attempt to show them I wasn't racist? I told them how racist my family was, and I shared every joke and comment my family made with a kind of, can you believe they said that? I mean, I subjected that couple to racism all night long and thought I was showing that I wasn't racist, right? But I would never have brought the conversation to racism if they were a white couple. They wouldn't have even been on my radar. So who I am, my true self, if you will, is changing based on the social conditions.
Context is key, right? And that's why I'm, even and these are the questions, right? The questions are introspecting and asking the questions, but the reality is, and I think I certainly allude to the fact that we are all flawed works in progress. And it is our ability to adapt, to evolve, to change, to grow, growth. And for me, I even define it. It's not just growing out, it's growing up. And yeah.
Yeah. I mean, think about how many white people are caught doing something clearly racist on tape. Not only will they always say, I'm not racist, but in saying that, they will often add, that is not my true self. And really, so your true self and your actual actions in the world are two different things. And we need to pay attention to what you say is your true self and not your actual actions in the world. So see how that functions. And as a sociologist, that is the question that has never failed me in my attempts to uncover. So, we're all saying we're not racist, but we have racist outcomes by every measure. So what's happening here, right? So how does it function for me to, in the face of actual racist action, insist that that's not my true self? Well, who can know my true self? Only me. So the moment I do that, I've put up a wall or a shield that deflects any ability for one, you to challenge me, and two, for me to have any kind of self-reflection. And that's what matters to me. Yeah.
There is one such a glaring use case, and that is comedy. And there are two, right? One is what I said on Twitter, not me, right? What was said on Twitter X years ago that now has come back to not just haunt, but there was a recent example as well. I think it was it Vogue or the editor or the new editor was basically either then fired or had to resign. But the other one is comedy, and I think part of what you're saying, just to go back and revisit that, is we have to acknowledge, as hard as it might be as a white person, that there is a degree of racism in us, built into us, almost, whether it's dormant, whether it's not, or whether it's just part of the culture in which we were raised. It's almost, and I don't know, I'm trying to think of how to ask the question, which is how do we deal with the fact that we may have laughed at a racist joke, told a racist joke, sat in the audience at a comedy club and heard racist jokes. As a Jew, the jokes were fine if they were about other people, but the minute someone made a joke about a Jew, it was offensive. And suddenly I was like, and suddenly that comedian might not have been found funny anymore. How does one cope with that? And that's just one tiny use case.
So I took notes because there was a lot of rich stuff in there. I think we have to start right now with what do we mean when we say racism? So anyone listening right now that's really struggling with the kinds of big claims you and I are making is likely defining racism as individual acts of conscious meanness or malintent. And as long as that is your definition, you're not going to be able to be in a conversation like this, right? We have to move well beyond that and understand it as a system. It is the foundation of both of our cultural, contexts. Racist ideology, practices, policies are circulating across the culture, and we all absorb them. Just let's go back to gender. You can try to resist gender socialization, but that's just it. You're going to have to try to resist it because it cannot be avoided. And either can racist socialization. If you can't move into that premise, you're going to get left behind, if you will. Right? You're going to be continually feeling defensive and insisting that you have nothing to do with any of this. Okay. So comedy is, I think it's an excuse to get to be racist, right? Like irony. And I think TV shows like Family Guy and South Park and maybe a little bit The Simpsons, right, allowed white people to be racist self-consciously, right? Like, I know I'm being racist, and therefore it doesn't count and it's okay. And it's a lot like what I exposed that couple to at dinner. I'm still reinforcing racist tropes and ideologies and stories. It's still being reinforced in everybody's mind who's listening. And so I don't think it's benign to do it in a joking way. And there is a concept in comedy called punching up, not down. So, you want to punch up, there's very different power dynamics, and it doesn't hurt in the same way. It doesn't invoke a deep centuries long history of oppression when you poke fun at, say, white people. But it's very, very different when you poke fun at people of color. So how do we deal with having laughed at a racist joke? We recognize that in those moments, we were reinforcing those ideas and those ideologies. Let's use Trump for an example. When he talked about Mexicans being rapists, I would never say that, but it's not like I'd never heard it. Right? When he said it, it wasn't like nonsensical to me. He was just reinforcing, I shouldn't say just in a minimizing way. He was reinforcing ideology that's already circulating, that I've already absorbed, and fortunately have the consciousness now to resist it. But if we're not willing to look at it, we can't resist it. That's the power of advertising. And so many white people think they're just exempt from all of that. So yes, you laughed at it in the past, recognize that it has contributed to your basic framework of racism. But now you can see it and you're going to challenge it, right? There's no shame in that, in the sense that you didn't know. You do now. And you take responsibility for it. That's when it often turns into a big social controversy, is people don't respond well when they're called out about the past. I mean, we need a little bit of grace on both sides, but I think more on the perpetrator.
Well, Anna Bowman says this woman is awesome. So, and Sarah Neely, and her pronouns are she and her, said punching up, not down. Yeah, I love that phrase. Is good food for thought and a good tool to bring to challenging conversations. One of our previous guests on the show, the wonderful Dr. Harry Cohen, who wrote a book called Be the Sun, Not the Salt, which is why I normally have sunflowers behind me when I do this. He said, ask Robin to talk about good, bad binary. So if you want to comment on that.
Sure. I mean, we've started it a little bit by thinking about the way that most people, I would just say the mainstream, thinks about what racism is. So if it's individual, conscious, intentional acts of meanness across race, well, that would make you a bad person who did those things, right? You would be an immoral person, a person of poor character. And so if you're against those things, if you claim that you would never do those things, you are a good person, you are a moral person. And so being a good moral person and complicity with racism become mutually exclusive. And I don't know that you could have come up with a more effective way to protect the system of racism. One, you basically exempt all white people from that system. I mean, what white person would say, I consciously and intentionally want to hurt people across race? Maybe far, 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 far out there, white nationalists, but not the average white person. Right? And you guarantee defensiveness. I mean, we've seen it. I just thought this week, somebody, how dare you suggest I'm racist? You apologize to me right now. It becomes akin to being a murderer. Although actually, if you called me a murderer, I'd be less defensive because I know I'm not. I'd be like, what? But you suggest somebody said or did something racist and you know, hilarity ensues. I hope you know how I meant that right there.
No, I think it's such a, you know, it's such a clear you know, delineation, right? Well, I know I'm not. I didn't murder anyone, at least not today. But just don't check my Twitter feed. But going back to what you were saying is this thing that we call being a racist or racism. It seems ambiguous and flowery and has to be and has to be seen in terms of, in this case, yes or no, when the reality is there are, you know, to use the phrase of black or white, 256 shades of gray.
Well, so here's my really simple way. So first of all, you mentioned white supremacy at the opening, and I used to have a strong reaction, of course, to that word too, that term. In most people's minds, that's people wearing white hoods. But it's actually a highly descriptive sociological term for the societies we live in. Societies that hold white people up as the representation of human, of ideal human. I mean, you know, you're from South Africa, you know there's a deep history of holding black people up as beasts, as less human, as more animalistic. And these themes are throughout the culture. There was a recent study of medical researchers that showed upwards of 50% believe black people feel less pain. I mean, these are really deep embedded ideas across the culture, right? So white supremacy is just a way to capture that. And so racism is a system, and here's my simple way. It is one group's collective racial bias. We all have racial bias, but one group's collective racial bias backed with legal authority and institutional control, which transforms it into a system. And the example I often use is women's suffrage. In South Africa, in the US, in India, in Britain, you know, you can name all these countries. There was a point in which women were denied the right to vote, and a point at which they were granted the right to vote. Could both men and women be prejudiced towards each other before that happened? I'm sure they were. But could women as a group deny every single man in the entire society his civil rights? No. Could men do that to women? Yes. What was the difference? They're both prejudiced. His prejudice was backed by legal authority and institutional control. And by the way, in the US anyway, I can say it was white women who were granted full access in 1920. So when you understand that, that is actually a radical paradigm shift that opens you up to so much more, that takes guilt off the table, that invokes responsibility, that actually is transformative and liberating. Right? Now I can stop the defensiveness, the denial, the arguing, the hurt feelings, and just get to work. Okay, well, what does this look like in my life? Right? Yeah. Well, sometimes I see videos on YouTube. This is another reason why I try not to go on any of this. But, you know, can you believe Robin DiAngelo says all white people are racist? And what I want to say back is, just do me a favor and take a pause and ask yourself, what is the criteria by which you would define somebody being racist? right? What is the criteria by which somebody, according to you, is racist? And if you ask yourself that, I think you're going to come up with individual, conscious, intentional meanness across race. And I'm not saying that, right? I would agree that you should take offense if that's what I meant. But that is not what I meant. I'm talking about a system that's inevitable.
Yeah, there's so much I likewise. I'm taking notes to your notes. I see.
I saw you.
I
I was
see
on
your
a roll
notes.
there. Sorry.
Sometimes I cheat. This is one way I cheat, which is that's when I'm taking feverish notes. But Harry said, "Thank you both so much for the work you do." I will take that as a compliment, but I will give the compliment squarely to you, Robin. We got some really interesting comments. My friend Ritesh says two things. He says, theme I've heard throughout my life. I don't normally like Indians, but you seem cool. You're not like the other Indians. And then he also adds the recent study into the genocide in Rwanda shows how deeply embedded the French cultural protection was a leading cause of all that craziness. So he just added that, and I wanted to bring that up. But Robin, when I came to this country, when I came to the US in 1997, I was just blown away by what I saw here and what I witnessed and what I felt. And funnily enough, the comparison I made to people in those years was, this is the same as South Africa. The only difference is in South Africa, they legalized it and they institutionalized it. That's exactly what I said to people initially. I just could not, I couldn't believe how it was out there, how open it was, how it was prevalent, even in Hollywood, in television, in movies, in the news. And I just couldn't believe it. People didn't see it like that. It was as simple as that. How on earth can you compare, this beautiful country, the greatest country in the world, to your backward, country where you came from? But that was the difference that I saw. It was the legalization. It was and of course, I think, and I'm sure you know this, when you look at the definitions as well of racism, it does talk to an inherent, I think it speaks to your shared, your group, your communal belief of superiority versus inferiority, which is exactly what you said. So for me, this kind of like comes full circle.
Well, so first of all, it serves us not to see it, right, as white people. And we are not taught our history. Most white people don't know their history, have these very limited superficial understandings. At the same time that the vast majority of white people live segregated lives. And I think the deepest message of white supremacy is that there's no loss for white people in living segregated lives. That I could go cradle to grave, as most white people do and will, with no authentic cross-racial relationships with Black people. And no one has ever given me any message that there's any loss to me, that there's any value in having cross-racial relationships. We'll talk in glowing terms about our segregated lives, neighborhoods, and schools. That is a really deep message, and it comes out in subtle ways. And I'm going to put air quotes around subtle to me. And so I actually would say that the U.S. has many legalized, institutionalized racist policies. We just hide that and say that it's objective, right? So look at all the voting suppression going on right now. I mean, this is clearly about race, but we just don't come out and say that it's about race. The outcomes will be the reinforcement of racial inequality, but we'll cover ourselves by this idea that these are neutral policies. And the last thing I want to say is, when I was in South Africa, believe it or not, white South Africans are saying it's different here. We don't have racism anymore because we had, the Truth and Reconciliation, right. And I build houses in the townships, and now they're the majority, and it's reverse racism, and it's the same the same way that we navigate this.
Yeah, it's all over. It's all over. Where the exorcism has been completed. I'm going to paste a couple of links into the comments below, which is obviously not that you need these comments to go out and buy White Fragility, but I'm going to do that, and then we're going to segue into. I have a specific question for you on your new book, which, by the way, you must like the month of June, because White Fragility came out in June, as did Nice Racism or Will. But there is something that you say in this book, and I think it's an important distinction. I'm going to read this. This is one of the descriptions, which is you explain how spiritual white progressives seeking community by co-opting indigenous and other groups' rituals create separation, not connection. So there's clearly a major there's a distinction between this, right, co-opting rituals, and this idea of, as you call it, this idea of cross-racial relationships and socializing. I would love to hear the clear differences between these 2 points.
Yeah, and of course the June is my publisher. It doesn't have anything to do with me. It's very similar with young people today. Two ideas. One is that history is an arc of progress, and so every generation is less racist, and I would disagree with that. I would say it is a continual cycle of push and pull and power struggles. It should be very clear to everybody today we're not post-racial. In many ways, the landscape looks like pre-civil rights in the United States. And so young people, this idea that young people are less racist, I think young white people today have a false sense of relationship because their musicians and their athletes that they worship are Black, and they have posters on their walls, and they have their CDs and their movies. And so there's a false sense of relationship that's not actually happening in their real lived lives. They're still living segregated lives. There was another part to that question you asked me, and I lost it. Let's see.
Yeah, I think it was this idea of the as you call them, spiritual. Well, first of all, I wanted you to tell us what is a spiritual white progressive versus just a white progressive,
well,
and then this idea of seeking community by co-opting these rituals. It almost seems like is it the same as acting? Is it vernacular? Is it lexicon? Is it talking? Is it acting? Is it clothing? Or is it a different kind of a ritual?
Yeah, it's kind of all of those things. So you might think of, so we're talking about a certain subset of white people that would be progressives, and New Agers. New Age is big amongst, just think about in just really general simplistic terms, the left. You're more likely to see white people who say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, right? I don't believe in a male God or, a judgmental God. I believe in, spirit and consciousness and, all this stuff. And there's an idealization in that group of indigenous cultures, this idea that they were pure and simple and close to the land and matriarchal, lots of very romanticized ideas, when there are many, many, many indigenous cultures, and like all cultures, they change over time. Some were warlike, some were peaceful. And so it just kind of makes them monolithic and reduces them to this romanticized caricature. And so you'll see people wanting to emulate using drums and peace circles and smudge sticks and going down to South America to try ayahuasca, hallucinogenic to reach enlightenment and all of these ways that aren't actually about relationships, certainly are not about supporting indigenous struggles in the U.S. context, and basically co-opt other cultures and profit from doing so.
to me, it all comes to a head when, when you talk about these mimicking behaviors. But I always try and find a quote that connects back to the subject at hand. And this is what I found for you, and also going back to that soliloquy on character. Your character defines who you are by the actions you take, right? Not by the words you speak or maybe the rituals you co-opt. And this is Catherine Pulsifer. And I just think, action, execution, the ability to change your behavior, the ability to take steps, the ability to make a difference through tangible actions has to begin this process of separating ourselves from, I guess, the rhetoric and the defensiveness, perhaps, that we discussed earlier.
Yeah, and that idea of a racist being a mean person who is aware of their meanness and all of that, that actually exempts most white people from any further action, right? Well, I'm not racist, so I'm good to go. And when the topic comes up, I'll just put my energy on showing you all the evidence that proves I'm not racist. None of that evidence will actually do that. So much of what white people think establishes them as not racist is not convincing to anyone who understands systemic racism. So that I have a Black friend, I had a Black roommate in college, I was in the Peace Corps, I speak several languages. All the evidence white people give, most of it is proximity, which is very revealing, because so what do I think a racist is if my evidence that I'm not that is that I can tolerate being close to Black people? Oh, I guess a racist can't be close to Black people, couldn't live in a large city, couldn't walk by people on the street, couldn't, be cordial at work. And that's absurd. I assure you that even... Yeah.
No, I was going to say there's clearly a different kind of proximity as well, which is, I'm a good person in my life, in my, neck of the woods or in my corner of the universe, as opposed to being able to extrapolate or at least zoom out and recognize that sometimes we are living in sheltered existences or in an environment that might not necessarily reflect the true state of affairs.
Yeah, I mean, when so many white people are so sure they're not racist, I always want to ask, how do you know? How can you be so sure? Talk to me about the neighborhood you grew up in and the school you went to and your friendship circles. If you're married, show me your wedding album. Where do you get your confidence that you're free of all racial bias? This is where Ibram Kendi says the opposite of racist isn't not racist, it's anti-racist. It's active. And Howard Zinn, white progressives love Howard Zinn, People's History of the US, he made a similar point. You can't be neutral on a moving train. So if you can grant the idea, the understanding that systemic racism is actually the default, that means it's at play all the time, then your so-called neutrality or lack of action is upholding it, right? There's just simply no neutral place. And I want to say something to all the white people. If you grant that racism is the default, it's not an aberration, it's the norm. 24/7, we live in a society that produces racist outcomes. And as a white person, I live, love, play, work, create in a racist society in racial comfort. I am comfortable in a racist society as a white person. And you just hold that and take a look at it. And hopefully you can't live with that. And you recognize that you're going to have to get uncomfortable. You're going to have some inconvenience in order to align what you say you value with the actual actions of your life.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, sorry, I thought you were finished, Karen.
I was just going to say, and it's hard, and it's also the most beautiful journey you could ever be on.
I was just going to add that I think there's something very liberating about this default. If you begin that it exists, that it is the default, that it is the norm, then you have to separate yourself. You have to fight. You have to take steps to move away from that, to push off or push back from that, as opposed to proving the negative. Here you have to.
Yep.
It's a really clear way, that and the definition. Robin, in the time we have left, I have so many questions. I know that you've been gracious enough to give us about 15 minutes or so in our Zoom after show, and I'll put that up shortly. But we did get two comments, and this is a show that is live, and it is about the community. It is about people watching. So I wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to address. This is Mark Emery, and he said, I'm curious about Dr. DiAngelo's thoughts on the role of corporations in dismantling racist infrastructure. It seems like there is so much performance or virtue signaling, and I'm curious about a more tactical, authentic approach.
I'm with you. There is a lot of virtue signaling, a lot of check the box. Last June, shortly after George Floyd's murder, I was off the hook with corporations asking me and all the other folks I know who do this work to come in, and that's just really settled down, right? It's not in right now or fashionable in the same way. And so we have to put the pressure there. It must be sustained. In general, it must be sustained. In other words, I am never going to be free of my conditioning. I'm not going to come to reach this not racist state. I am on a lifelong journey, and corporations need to be on lifelong journeys. Try saying, if you are going to put in your mission statement at a corporation that you value diversity, then it better be part of the outcomes you measure for people's success, right? You have to hold people accountable to outcomes, and that takes ongoing work.
Absolutely. A wonderful, wonderful response. And here's the last one we have time for. Ted Wright. I just thought this was very meta because, in thinking about your journey, you probably had no idea that and nor would you have wanted the events of, what happened with George Floyd, etc. But I would love for you to comment on this on a personal, on a personal basis in terms of being elevated into the spotlight and how you've coped with it.
I very much appreciate this question. While I would only dream that the message of the book would get out, I still did not expect that. And I am somebody who, came late to even academia. I graduated with a bachelor's degree when I was 34 years old. I grew up poor and working class. I've been an academic now for a while, and you write articles and nobody reads them, but you have to write them. And that somebody quoted one day from the article White Fragility, and it went viral and exploded worldwide, and it changed my life. But I never expected to be what you might call a celebrity. My daughter's always telling me, Mom, you're famous. And I'm like, am I really? I feel like the most regular person. And then you add two things. It's racism, which is arguably the most charged topic in society. So you can expect from every side not to be able to get it right. And then you add social media, which has a slant of, I would say, meanness and vilification and shaming. And it has been intense and very, very difficult. I'm getting a thicker skin, but wow, it's been a challenging year. And I've had to push through my own. I'm not doing this anymore. I give up. I have to remind myself that the loudest voices are not necessarily representative. I get hundreds, if not thousands, of emails from people all over the world thanking me. But the loud voices are hard. The critique from the right doesn't hurt me. I mean, we actually had to put a filter on my email that if it has the C word, it can't get through. I mean, the misogyny and the hatred and the death threats, but I expect that from the right. The critiques from the left are harder. They're more hurtful. They cause me pause more. They're more confusing. So yeah, it's been difficult. How do I cope with it? Therapy. I have a support group of other white people, what we call a white affinity group. We meet weekly to talk about these challenges. I have people of color in my life who've agreed to be there for me. So just one day at a time.
Well, Stephen Rubin says, you are far from a regular person. You are a beautiful person, very special person. And hopefully, Robin, conversations like today, I just want to say that on a personal level, first of all, do not follow Robin on any of the social medias, because she's not on them.
No.
But you know what I really loved about this process initially when I reached out to you, we didn't figure it out because you were so busy at that time. I mean, this literally was at the pinnacle in 2020, and then I reached out again, and I was so happy to get a response from you. And I think what I loved most about you coming on the show is that you wanted to know who I was and where my heart was and where I was coming from. And I think being able to have that conversation and earn the right, because I think it's a privilege and it's a right to have a conversation at a time like this with someone like yourself, where you have put that stake in the ground. That last question, talks about the price, that it comes with, but ultimately it's moving us forward by debating, by discussing, and by trying to come to a new, better place in a middle ground. So I just want to thank you so much for your graciousness. I'm going to ask you one question more as I just flash a few more things, and then we'll go to the Zoom after show, and I'll put that link up as well, which is define a nice racist, because we know what a non-racist, I'm not a racist, we know what an anti-racist is. What is a nice racist?
Well, it's a white person, and just everybody put your seatbelts on. I believe all white people absorb racist ideologies, investments, and develop racist patterns of behaviors, right? So all white people are shaped by the forces of racism. And a nice racist is someone who thinks that smiling and niceness interrupts all of that. And shows that they're not racist. So my evidence that I'm not racist is I'm really nice to people across race. And of course, nice is better than mean. I'm not saying be mean, but niceness is not an indicator that racism is not present. In some ways, niceness makes it much harder to get your hands on. There's more gaslighting. A culture of niceness is a conflict avoidant, passive aggressive culture. It is a culture of white comfort. And of course, that is not a conducive context for challenging racism, right? So a nice racist is a white progressive who thinks smiling as you pass people on the streets means you're not racist.
And generally,
be a heck of a lot of us.
And generally, those smiles probably have elements of fear as well, which again is systemic. We're going to go over to the Zoom after show. This was a wonderful conversation for me. I'm so humbled to have had this time with you. Please go and pre-order Nice Racism: How Progressive White People Perpetuate Racial Harm, available on June 29th. And of course, the book that began this conversation for me, it's a continued conversation. Your books are like chapters of a bigger book, a bigger conversation that, as you say, never ends. It is a journey. It is a work in progress. White fragility, why it's so hard for white people to talk about racism. We always end off, Robin, with a little bit, going back to a little bit of the ridiculousness. Chuck Norris normally determines whether a guest is a hit or miss. Of course, I almost had to ditch this because apparently he was in the crowd on January 6th, but he wasn't. So we'll end up with Chuck giving us the verdict.
You are Chuck Norris approved.
which I think was pretty obvious. I will be back tomorrow, and Robin, let's head on over to the Zoom after show. Thank you so much.
Can I just say one quick thing? Thank you for promoting my books. If you're going to order them, try to order them from Black-owned bookstores. And within this week, I'll have some links on my website. But just do a little research and let's support Black communities.
And I will say, I will just add to that, which is send me any links that you like, and I will be sure to share those in in the days, weeks ahead, but certainly as we get closer to your publish date.
Okay.
All right. I'll be back tomorrow. Let's head on over to the Zoom after show.
Thank you for watching the show about hope, positivity, optimism, and if there's time left over, a little bit of marketing with your host, multiple author, and global keynote speaker, Joseph Jaffe. If you like the show, tell a friend or two. Please subscribe to the show, and if you want to get inside news, previews of upcoming guests, and much more, visit josephjaffe.com/subscribe to sign up for the show's newsletter.
And despite the best ministrations of your wife, you still look ugly.